Well, Nietzsche believed that Christianity, as it stood at the end of the 1800s, was an untenable philosophy because he thought it had abandoned its moral obligations by escaping into some beyond, and therefore damned life as it was actually lived by human beings. So he felt that the demise was a good thing. He points out one other thing, and this is the difference between having a theory and then learning to theorize. He says, look, if you've been raised in a tradition, whatever that tradition happens to be, you have a belief system, whatever that belief system happens to be, and it falls apart on you at any one point, you suffer for two reasons. The first is, your belief system fell apart. And that's not a good thing. It leaves everything unfixed and open, and you drown in possibility in a sense. That's a Kierkegaardian phrase. But the second consequence is even worse. Once you've learned that one belief system that's solid could be demolished and fall apart, then it's very difficult ever again to have any faith in any belief systems whatsoever. So not only do you become a doubter of your own creed, let's say, you become a meta-doubter, which is the doubter of all belief systems. Well, in the step from that to nihilism, maybe those are exactly the same thing. You know, and that's really, you could think about that in some sense as the disease of the critical rational mind. It can saw off any branch that it's sitting on. And you know, the utility of that is, leave no stone unturned, right? You're supposed to question things, and the utility of that is you learn new things. But the price you pay for it is that you're not necessarily ever certain about anything. And, you know, you could say, well, maybe you shouldn't be certain about anything, but you can forget that. You know, you're going to have to act as if you're certain many times in your life. For when you choose a permanent mate, for example, if you do that, which you probably will because you're university educated, and university educated people still do that, although no one else does. So, and you're going to pick a career, and you're going to make decisions one after the other, about which, if you're not certain, you can't make, in which case you have no life. You're just a whirlwind of chaos. So you're stuck with the necessity of following a course of action, which is acted out certainty, that your intellect cannot regard as appropriate. And that's hard on people. Why should I choose this instead of this? Why should I act this way instead of that way? You know, I don't know is not a very useful answer when you're a creature that's as cognitively able as we are. This is something absolutely brilliant. It's very difficult for me to believe that it was written so long ago. So, this is Dostoevsky's criticism of communism. 40 years before communism was a political force. So Dostoevsky's thinking really hard about this nihilism problem. By the way, Nietzsche read Dostoevsky quite extensively. He's thinking about it. He thinks, well, there seems to be two alternatives. One is this superhuman nihilism, which is sort of a variant of what Nietzsche proposed, because Nietzsche proposed that it would become the responsibility of every human being after the death of their religious tradition to establish their own values. Now you think, that's it. He didn't think people could do it. He thought there'd have to be a new kind of person who could manage it, because, you know, he's basically asking you to generate coherent and pragmatically applicable philosophical structure out of nothing during your lifetime. It's like, well, good luck with that. You know, plus he also assumed that people create values, or that they could create values. And, you know, that's true to some degree, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the phenomenological end of things. But it's not self-evident, right? Because one of the things you may notice is that you can't force yourself to love someone. Right? You can't just decide that you're going to value someone and then poof, that happens. In fact, you may want with all your heart, or at least with all your mind, to value someone because they deserve it. They've never mistreated you. Maybe you've said you'd be loyal to them, and poof, someone comes along, you're tremendously attracted to them, and off you go like someone who's possessed. Well, did you create that value? It's like, well, and then closer to your own experience, like, can you actually make yourself interested in something you're bored about? It's like, good luck trying that, you know. You'd rather clean up underneath your bed than read a paper you don't want to read. You know, and you can't just tell yourself, well, I need to read this paper for the following reasons, and poof, it becomes interesting. It's like, no, no, no. Your value systems, whatever they happen to be, are off doing their own thing. And the reason for that, in large part, is because they're possessed by ideas that you don't know about, that have these historical roots, and that play you in some sense like they play puppets. And this stuff is no joke. Okay, so this is what Dostoevsky said way back in the late 1800s. This was in a book called Notes from Underground. And it's about a man who's like Hamlet in some sense. He's a modern man. He's a 20th century man, really. And his problem is, he's hyper intelligent and he can't figure out what the hell he should do with his life. And it's really bothering him. And it's worse than that, because not only is it really bothering him that he can't get his act together and act with any degree of consistency and character, but he knows that he can't do that, and he tortures himself about his weakness at the same time. So he's a very neurotic character, but he's a sophisticated and intelligent neurotic. And so he's run through all the arguments that you might conjure up to sort of talk yourself out of being neurotic and suffering. He has nothing but contempt for his own character. He thinks he's much weaker than people who can just act without thinking. And he's in this pit, this horrible pit, and it's a wonderful thing to read. It's quite blackly comical. And it's a great philosophical and psychological study. Anyways, in one of the sections of this book, Dostoevsky's protagonist starts to talk about alternatives to his nihilistic hopelessness. And he thinks about utopianism as a potential alternative. So what's utopianism? Well, in some sense, medieval Christianity promised people redemption after they died, while a utopian creed does the same thing, except it promises it here and now. So that's, communism was a particular utopian creed. And fascism had the same element, although it was I don't know how to describe it. It was less intellectually sophisticated than communism. Communism basically said, look, if you guys just stop being selfish and share, we can transform the world into a place where everyone will have enough of everything, and everyone will be able to do what they want to do. And because of the natural goodness of people, if selfishness can be overcome, that'll be the next best thing to a paradise. It's like it was a powerful idea for people, you know. 80 years of our history was spent assessing and battling out the validity of that idea, and hundreds of millions of people died as a consequence of it. And you can understand why it was so attractive. I mean, still utopian ideologies are attractive to people. I mean, it's hard to read radical Islam as anything other than a utopian ideology. You know, the idea is once you establish rigid Sharia, then poof, you know, you've got the kingdom of God on earth. Well, and part of the reason that the radical Muslims are fighting against the West is because they see what they're doing as a counterposition to Western nihilism. And it's partly because they don't want to fall into that. You know, we would say, well, that's progress. It's like, yeah, it's progress by our standards, and it comes at a price. And also, we don't even understand how it was that we paid the price. So, the reason I'm telling you this is because you don't want to be thinking for any time at all that these sorts of issues have disappeared or that they're not relevant. They're relevant. Now, the guy who's advising Putin, his name is Alexander Dugin, and he's no admirer of Western liberalism. He thinks about it as fundamentally nihilistic. He thinks that its universal application would result in the dissolution of all local culture and the production of this sort of materialistic hyper-individuality. And he's an admirer of tradition, you know, and specifically Russian Orthodox tradition. And he believes that the cult cultures, India, Russia, and China in particular, should develop their own local cultures, keep the West the hell out, and act as a counterposition to nihilistic liberalism.